I signed up for the military straight out of high school. Honestly, there wasn't a whole lot of destiny in the decision. I just needed a way out of my small town, a chance to prove something to myself. By the time I met Jess, my wife, I'd been stationed in more places than I could count, but I still felt like I hadn't found home. She was from a military family, so she knew the drill. Deployments, late-night calls, me disappearing for months on end. I thought that shared understanding would make things easier for us. We got married pretty fast, faster than a lot of people thought was wise. But then again, when you're in the service, fast is just part of the deal. She was smart, funny, and somehow managed to put up with my weird hours and the constant uncertainty. I'd never really had a relationship that's serious before. I figured she'd be the one I'd finally settle down with. Maybe start a family. In the beginning, everything was perfect, or as perfect as it could be given the circumstances. I'd be away for long stretches, but we kept in touch through messages and quick video calls when I had the chance. I felt like I had a partner, someone who was solidly in my corner no matter where in the world I was. It made the long nights and tough missions a little easier, knowing there was someone waiting for me back home. After a while, though, things started to feel different. I can't even pinpoint when it happened, but something shifted. It was in the way her messages started to get shorter, less detailed. The calls became a little forced, and there were times she didn't pick up at all, saying she just missed it or wasn't near her phone. I chalked it up to the strain of long distance. Military life isn't easy on anyone, especially the people left at home. It eats away at you, and I assumed we were just hitting that rough patch all couples in the service go through. But things kept getting stranger. Little inconsistencies popped up here and there. A weird charge on the credit card. Nights she said she was with friends, but didn't mention anyone specific. It felt too small to call her out on, so I brushed it under the rug, telling myself I was overthinking it. She'd never given me a reason to doubt her before, so why would she now? One night, on a rare weekend home, we went out to a small bar near the base. A bunch of people I served with were there, and we were all in high spirits, catching up and joking around. She was chatting with one of my higher-ups, someone I trusted and respected. They seemed friendly enough, but maybe a little too friendly. There was this look, an almost secretive smile they shared that I didn't quite understand. But again, I shrugged it off. I trusted her. I trusted him. If you start doubting everyone around you, you're going to go crazy in this line of work. Looking back, that was probably the first red flag. That night at the bar stuck with me, even if I couldn't explain why. Jess's laugh was a little louder, her smile a bit wider around him. My superior, Captain Mitchell. I'd served under him for years, trusted him with my life. So I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that maybe it was all in my head. But that seed of doubt had been planted, and it was harder to ignore than I wanted to admit. The strange feelings didn't go away, though. They just got louder. Jess started mentioning Mitchell more often, talking about how he'd been over to the house to drop something off or fix something that was broken. She laughed it off, saying she'd called him because she didn't want to bug me about minor stuff while I was deployed. He's just being helpful, she'd say with this easy, dismissive shrug. And I tried to let it go. After all, Mitchell was a friend, right? And who else would be there to help her when I wasn't around? But it wasn't just him. I started noticing the same familiarity with other guys from the base, too. My buddy Mike, who was a few ranks lower than me, would mention that he'd seen Jess around or that she dropped by with food for the guys during training exercises. It felt nice at first hearing that she was part of the community, looking out for my people when I wasn't around. It was like she was a little piece of home for all of us. Except over time it started to feel weird, like she was always there, even when she didn't need to be. She'd hang around the base on days off, bring meals over, chat with the guys, especially the single ones, which she claimed was just because she felt bad for them being on their own. They don't have anyone to cook for them, she'd joke, brushing it off. But I started feeling like maybe it wasn't just about the food. It didn't help that people started making these small, offhand comments, little jokes that rubbed me the wrong way. Stuff like, "You better keep an eye on Jess, man. She's everyone's favorite." Or, "Your wife's the real MVP. She's a better friend than you." They'd laugh, and I'd laugh along with them, pretending it didn't bother me. But I couldn't help but wonder what they really meant by it. Then, during one deployment, she went radio silent for a few days. No texts, no calls, nothing. That was unusual, especially for her. She was always checking in, always making sure I was okay. When I finally got hold of her, she sounded strange, rushed, distracted. She mumbled something about her phone being dead, but it didn't sound like the whole story. I pressed her, just a little, and she got defensive, almost angry. Why are you always so suspicious? She snapped. Don't you trust me? That question hit harder than I wanted to admit. Of course, I wanted to trust her. I didn't want to be the kind of person who doubted his own wife. I wanted to believe that whatever was going on was innocent, that I was just overthinking things. So I let it go. Again, I told myself I was just stressed from the job, from the endless cycles of deployment, and coming home to an empty house. I figured maybe I was just struggling with the distance, that maybe it was all my own insecurities getting the best of me. But that didn't change the fact that every time I was on base, someone had a new story about Jess, about how she'd been around, helping out, keeping the boys company, as one of them put it. And there was always this smirk, this knowing look that made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. Little by little, those moments started piling up. It was like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit, but that nagging feeling in my gut was getting harder to ignore. After a while, I started hearing things. Nothing direct, nothing you could point to as outright proofs. Just rumors. They were quiet, almost whispered, and no one said anything to my face. But I could feel it in the air. People would go quiet when I walked into a room, or I'd catch a few guys giving each other these sideways looks. Sometimes, they'd look at me with this uncomfortable expression, like they wanted to say something but weren't sure how. I brushed it off for a while, chalking it up to the usual gossip that comes with being part of a close-knit group. Military life is like that. Everyone knows each other's business, and people talk. I told myself that whatever I was feeling was just my own paranoia, that Jess wouldn't actually give anyone a reason to talk about her like that. She was my wife, after all. We'd promised each other that we'd get through this, that the distance wouldn't break us. But then one night, I was out having a drink with a few of the guys, and the conversation turned to Jess. It started innocently enough, with someone asking if she was doing okay, and if she'd been able to visit me on base recently. I answered, keeping it casual, and trying not to let on that I felt weird about how often people seemed to bring her up. And then one of the younger guys, Thompson, a fresh-faced kid, barely out of training, chimed in, laughing a little too hard. Oh, yeah, Jess is really friendly, he said with this grin that made my skin crawl. She always brings us food, keeps us company when you're gone. I swear, man, she's like everyone's wife. Everyone around the table laughed. But it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was the kind of laugh that had an edge to it, something that made me feel like I was the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. I tried to keep my cool, to laugh it off, but something about Thompson's tone just dug into me. I shot him a look, trying to keep it light, but making it clear I wasn't in the mood for whatever he was hinting at. Careful there, Thompson, I said, forcing a laugh. That's my wife you're talking about. He looked down, muttering an apology, but the damage was done. The whole vibe around the table had shifted. The other guys stopped laughing, and this awkward silence settled over us. One of the older guys, Sergeant Rayburn, someone who'd been around a while, cleared his throat and changed the subject, steering the conversation back to something safer. But I could still feel it, this thick tension that wouldn't go away. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. The way Thompson had looked at me, the way everyone else had laughed, there was something there, something I wasn't seeing. I started replaying every moment, every odd comment, every little joke that people had made about Jess over the past few years. And every time I tried to talk myself out of it, to convince myself I was being paranoid, I'd remember the way Jess had smiled at Captain Mitchell at that bar, or the way she'd gotten defensive when I'd asked her about being MIA for a few days, or the way my buddy Mike had mentioned her dropping by the base so casually, like it was no big deal that my wife was always hanging around when I wasn't there. I kept thinking about it, trying to piece it all together, but every time I got close to admitting what I feared, I'd pull back. Because if I actually let myself believe it, if I let myself really think about the possibility that she was betraying me, that maybe the rumors weren't just rumors, well, I didn't know if I was ready to handle that truth. After that night with Thompson's everyone's wife comment, I couldn't just ignore the feeling gnawing at me. But I also didn't know who to turn to. The military's a tight community, and talking about your personal problems, especially something as serious as this, can backfire real quick. Word gets around fast, and the last thing I wanted was for my suspicions to become everyone's business. But I needed to talk to someone, or I'd drive myself insane. I ended up calling my closest friend on base, Adam. He was one of the few people I could trust without question. We'd been through deployments together, spent countless nights watching each other's backs in situations that most people couldn't even imagine. If there was anyone who'd give it to me straight, it was him. We met up at a bar off base, somewhere quiet and out of the way. I didn't want to risk anyone overhearing. Adam could tell something was up from the moment I walked in. He just gave me a nod, ordered us a couple of beers, and waited for me to start talking. I wasn't usually one to open up about personal stuff, but he didn't push. He just sat there, letting me take my time, watching me with this steady, calm look that made me feel like somehow it would be okay to tell him. Eventually, I told him everything. The weird comments, the uneasy feelings, the nights Jess didn't answer her phone, and the rumors that kept creeping into every corner of my life. I could feel the anger bubbling up in me as I spoke, a mix of anger at Jess and, honestly, at myself. I felt stupid, paranoid, and maybe even a little guilty for doubting her. But as I got it all out, piece by piece, Adam just listened, nodding occasionally, his face serious. When I was done, he leaned back, thinking it over. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just tapped his fingers on the table. I could tell he was choosing his words carefully, which wasn't like him. Adam was the type who usually called things as he saw them, but this time he was holding back. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Look, man, you know I'm not one to jump to conclusions. But if you're feeling like this, maybe you should trust your gut. Sometimes people show us who they are in little ways, you know? And we ignore it because we don't want to see it." I took a long sip of my beer, trying to swallow down the discomfort. "You're saying you think something's going on?" Adam shrugged. "All I'm saying is if it were me, I want to know for sure. I want to stop guessing, stop wondering. Whatever the truth is, it's better than driving yourself crazy like this." I nodded, letting his words sink in. He was right, of course. I couldn't live in this limbo forever, dissecting every word Jess said, replaying every glance and smile she shared with someone else. I needed to know one way or another. Adam put a hand on my shoulder. "Look, I'll keep my ears open. If there's anything to find, I'll find it. But don't do anything stupid, all right? Just take it slow. If she's really doing something behind your back, the truth has a way of coming out." I thanked him and left the bar feeling a little better, but also more certain than ever that I had to get to the bottom of this. I didn't want to be that guy who ignored the signs, who let himself get played for years. And I knew I couldn't just keep asking her straight out, hoping for a different answer. If she was lying, she wasn't about to admit it just because I asked. As I drove home, my mind was racing with possibilities. I wasn't sure if I was ready for what I might find, but I knew one thing. If something was going on, I'd rather face it head on than keep living in the dark. A few weeks passed after that talk with Adam, and I tried to keep things as normal as possible. Jess and I still talked on the phone, I still came home for the occasional weekend, and we kept up our routines. But everything felt strained, like there was an invisible wall between us that neither of us would acknowledge. Every time she laughed, every time she'd tell me about her day, there was a part of me that was trying to figure out if she was being real or if she was putting on an act. One night, while I was on base, Jess messaged me saying she was out with the girls. She'd send me photos sometimes to reassure me. Group selfies, cocktails in hand, the usual girls' night out stuff. This time was no different. She sent a picture of her and a couple of her friends at a bar, smiling with drinks in their hands. I tried to feel reassured, to tell myself I was overthinking it. She was just having fun, but something in me couldn't let it go. I decided to call her later that night, just to hear her voice and maybe put myself at ease. It was late, but I knew she'd still be awake, given her night out. I figured she'd pick up, chat a little, and I could go to bed with that familiar feeling of comfort. But she didn't answer. I tried again. Still nothing. After a couple more attempts, she finally texted back with, "Hey, sorry. It's too loud here. I'll call you when I'm on my way home." That answer felt off. Jess was usually quick to answer, and even if she couldn't talk, she'd at least pick up and let me know she was okay. Something about her avoiding the call just sat wrong with me. But again, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that she'd just been busy with her friends. She'd call me back later, I thought, and then I could hear her voice, hear the smile that I used to be so sure was for me alone. Except she didn't call me back that night, or the next morning. I got a brief text the following afternoon saying, "Sorry, babe. Got home super late, crashed right away. Love you," but that didn't feel right either. It was like she was rushing, trying to cover up something. I'd seen her on late nights before, and she always made a point to call, even if it was just for a minute. This was different. I went over the whole situation in my mind a dozen times, and the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me. I knew I couldn't just keep brushing things off. If she was hiding something, it was my right to know. So, I did something I'd never done before. I started digging. Jess was never one to hide her passwords or be secretive with her phone or social media. She'd always been open about that stuff, and maybe it was naive, but I'd trusted her enough to never feel the need to check. But now, I found myself logging into her social media, combing through her messages, looking for, I don't even know what I was looking for, just something to confirm or disprove the thoughts swirling around in my head. Most of what I found was innocent enough. Chats with friends, family, normal day-to-day stuff. But then I found one conversation that stood out. It was with Mike, the same buddy of mine who'd mentioned Jess visiting the base before. It was mostly friendly banter, talking about casual things, nothing too suspicious. But as I scrolled back, I noticed that the messages got friendlier the deeper I went. Little jokes, inside references, things that felt a little too familiar. And then there were messages like, "Wish you were here tonight, Jess, winky face, and last night was fun, let's do it again soon." Innocent enough on the surface, but when you're already feeling suspicious, those words take on a different meaning. My hand started shaking as I read through it. Part of me wanted to stop, to close the app and pretend I'd never seen any of it. But I kept going, needing to know if there was more, if there was anything solid that would either confirm or calm the storm inside me. Just as I was about to give up and tell myself I was reading too much into things, I saw a message from Jess that made my heart sink. It was simple, just one line, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "Can't wait to see you next time he's away. Winky face." I put my phone down, staring at the screen as the weight of that message settled over me. Finding that message was like the ground being ripped out from under me. My head was buzzing, my chest tight, but I still tried to tell myself that maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Maybe there was some context I didn't understand. But that winking face? That couldn't be innocent. It was like a silent confirmation of every doubt and suspicion I'd tried so hard to ignore. For a few days, I kept quiet. I went about my routine like nothing had happened. But inside, I was in turmoil. I kept running through scenarios in my mind, trying to figure out how to bring it up, what to say, how to get her to tell me the truth without making it obvious that I'd gone through her messages. Because once I admitted that, I knew there'd be no going back. Whatever trust we had left would be shattered. Adam noticed something was off pretty quickly. He could see it on my face, the way I'd zone out in the middle of a conversation or stare at my phone with this blank look. One day, he pulled me aside during a break and asked me if I was okay. I shrugged it off, but he wasn't buying it. "Did you find something?" he asked, keeping his voice low. His expression was serious, no hint of his usual lightheartedness. I didn't even have to say anything. I just nodded, and that was enough. Adam put a hand on my shoulder and sighed, like he'd been half expecting this. "Look, man," he said slowly, "if there's really something going on, you need to be smart about it. Don't just go off on her. Get all the facts first. Make sure there's no doubt in your mind." I knew he was right. As much as I wanted to storm home, lay it all out in front of her, and demand an explanation, I also knew that would probably lead nowhere. Jess was sharp. She'd find a way to twist things or gaslight me into thinking I'd misread the situation. I needed something concrete, something she couldn't talk her way out of. So, instead of confronting her, I started paying more attention. I'd check her social media more often, watch for any hints in her texts or posts. I try to keep track of her stories, her outings, any mention of the guys from base, especially Mike. I also asked Adam to keep an eye out on his end, to let me know if he saw Jess around or heard anything suspicious from the other guys. In the meantime, Jess kept acting normal. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. She'd call me, text me sweet messages, and talk about our future plans as if everything was fine. There were even moments where I'd start to doubt myself again, wondering if I was making it all up in my head. But then I'd think of that message to Mike, and the doubt would come flooding back, along with that sick feeling in my stomach. A few weeks later, I had a weekend leave and went back home. I wasn't sure how I'd act around her, but I knew I couldn't pretend forever. The minute I walked through the door, Jess greeted me with a big smile and a hug, as if nothing had changed. She seemed genuinely happy to see me, and for a second, I almost let myself believe that maybe everything was fine, that I was just paranoid. But then, as we settled in for the night, she got a text. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, and when the screen lit up, I caught a quick glance at the name. It was Mike. My stomach twisted as she picked up the phone, glanced at it, and then quickly put it down, face down. I tried to keep my expression neutral, to act like I hadn't noticed. But inside, I was seething. She hadn't even bothered to hide it this time. And now I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't just imagining things. Later that night, as she was getting ready for bed, I casually brought up Mike. I said something about how he'd mentioned her visits, trying to see if she'd slip up or give me anything. But she didn't flinch. She just laughed, saying he was such a goof, and that she was just being friendly. "You know me," she said with that easy smile. "I just like taking care of people." Her words felt like acid in my chest. She was so comfortable lying, so casual about it, like this was just a game to her. I could barely look at her, knowing what I knew, but I forced myself to keep it together. I needed more than just suspicions and half-glimpsed messages. I needed real proof, something that would leave her no room to deny it. So, I waited. I went to bed that night next to her, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I thought I was prepared to play the waiting game, to collect enough evidence before confronting Jess. But there's something deeply unsettling about lying beside someone you suspect is betraying you. The bed felt colder, her presence next to me more like a weight than a comfort. Every time she'd shift or reach over to hold me in her sleep, I'd feel a pang of something I can only describe as betrayal mixed with self-loathing. I hated that I couldn't trust her, and I hated that I was still lying there pretending I could. The next morning, I got up early, needing some time alone to clear my head. I grabbed my coffee and sat out on the porch, watching the sun come up, feeling the quiet settle around me. But my mind was anything but quiet. All I could think about was her phone lighting up with Mike's name and the way she'd brushed it off so easily. I was running through everything Adam had said, every hint and warning sign I'd ignored, all the pieces that were now coming together in a way I didn't want to see. When Jess finally got up, she joined me outside, sitting next to me with her own cup of coffee, looking as relaxed as ever. We chatted about small things, the weather, her plans for the week, nothing of substance. I couldn't bring myself to look her in the eyes, knowing what I knew, or what I thought I knew. She didn't seem to notice my distance, or maybe she was just good at pretending. A few hours later, she told me she was heading out to run some errands. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about it, but this time I felt a twist in my gut. I decided, almost without thinking, to follow her. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad movie, but I needed to know where she was really going. I waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed my keys and followed her car at a distance, making sure not to get too close. She drove through town, taking a few turns that seemed random, until eventually she pulled into a small park on the other side of town. I parked a bit further away, staying in the car while I watched her. After a few minutes, another car pulled up, a familiar one. My chest tightened when I saw who got out. It was Mike. He looked around almost nervously and then walked over to where Jess was sitting on a bench under a tree. She stood up to greet him, and they exchanged a quick hug. But the hug lingered a little too long, and there was something in the way she looked at him that felt intimate. They sat down together, talking in a way that felt too familiar, too close for two people who were just friends. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see their body language. The way she leaned toward him, the way he'd touch her arm or shoulder every so often. It was enough to confirm my worst fears. I felt like I was in a trance, watching them from a distance. Part of me wanted to storm over, to confront them right then and there, but I forced myself to stay put. I needed more than just a hug and somebody language. I needed undeniable proof. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, my hands shaking as I tried to keep the camera steady. It felt wrong, invasive, like I was stooping to some low level that I'd always sworn I wouldn't. But the reality was that I couldn't take her word for anything anymore. And I knew if I went to her without proof, she'd find a way to talk her way out of it, to twist things until I was the one apologizing. After about an hour, they finally got up. They hugged again, and this time, Mike brushed his hand down her back, lingering a little too close to the small of her waist. I felt a surge of anger rise up, but I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. They said their goodbyes, and he left first. She lingered in the park for a few minutes, probably to make it seem like she'd been alone. I waited until she was gone before driving back home. My mind was racing, caught between anger, pain, and this strange sense of release. I finally had something. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to know that I wasn't imagining things. When Jess got back home later that day, I was sitting in the kitchen pretending to scroll through my phone. She walked in with a breezy smile, setting her bag down and chatting about her errands like nothing was out of the ordinary. I could hardly look at her. Every word out of her mouth sounded hollow, and every smile felt like a slap. I was holding back a storm, every ounce of my self-control focused on not letting her see how close I was to losing it. I didn't say anything about what I'd seen at the park. I couldn't. Not yet. I needed more than just photos of her and Mike together, more than just my gut feeling. I knew if I confronted her now, she'd twist it, make me out to be the paranoid, jealous husband, and I'd be left feeling crazier than ever. Instead, I waited until she was in the shower later that evening and slipped into the bedroom to check her phone. My heart was pounding as I picked it up, half expecting it to be locked or for her to have changed her password. But she hadn't. That was Jess's style, keeping things just open enough so I wouldn't feel the need to check. I went straight to her messages, scrolling down to find her recent chats. And there it was right near the top, Mike. My hands shook as I opened the conversation, dreading what I might find but knowing I had to see it. At first, it was pretty tame, just friendly back and forth, as if they were any two friends. They talked about their day, little jokes, things that seemed innocent enough if you didn't know the context. But as I scrolled further back, the tone shifted. There were late-night messages, texts that stretched into the early hours, conversations that got a little too personal, a little too familiar. And then I found it. It was a message from her sent the night she'd supposedly been out with the girls. The same night she didn't answer my calls. It was a simple message, but it felt like a gut punch. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to do it again. Winky face. There was no mistaking what she meant. There was no way to twist those words, no context that could make it innocent. She wasn't just meeting up with him for coffee or friendly chats. This was something real, something physical. And from the way they talked, it hadn't been a one-time thing. It had been going on for, I don't even know how long. My mind went blank for a second. I could hear the water still running in the shower. Jess humming to herself, completely oblivious to the fact that her secret was out. I stared at the phone. That single line burned into my brain. All the little errands, the unexplained absences, the times she'd been unreachable. It all made sense now. And the worst part was it wasn't just Mike. As I kept scrolling, I found conversations with Captain Mitchell too. They weren't as blatant as the texts with Mike, but there were enough hints, enough winking emojis and suggestive comments to paint a clear picture. She'd been with him too. Maybe not as recently, but the tone of their chats left no room for doubt. And then, buried even further down, was a thread with Thompson, the younger guy, the one who'd made that everyone's wife joke at the bar. His texts were more straightforward, less careful than the others. Late-night texts, things like, "When's he leaving again?" and "Last night was wild. Didn't know you could keep up, winky face." I couldn't breathe. It was like finding out I'd been living in someone else's life, in someone else's marriage. 3 guys from my own base. People I trusted, people I worked with every day. And Jess, the person I'd built my life around, had been sneaking around with all of them. The shower turned off, and I heard her humming as she stepped out, oblivious. I knew I couldn't hold it in any longer. The truth was burning a hole in my chest, and I needed to let it out. She walked into the bedroom, towel around her, smiling at me like nothing was wrong. And I couldn't keep it in. I looked at her and said, "How long, Jess?" She froze, her smile fading. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." I held up her phone, screen still open to the messages with Mike. I watched her face go pale as the realization hit. She didn't even try to grab the phone or deny it. She just stood there, staring at me, caught. The room felt heavy, thick with silence. Jess's face went through a range of emotions. Shock, fear, guilt, even a flash of anger. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. I could tell she was trying to calculate, to come up with some explanation that might soften the blow. But I was done with excuses. I'd spent too many months, maybe even years, doubting myself, questioning her loyalty, letting her convince me that I was the problem. This was my breaking point. "How long, Jess?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. I could feel the anger simmering beneath my words, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wanted the truth, and I knew if I exploded, she'd just clam up or turn it back on me. She looked down, avoiding my eyes, and finally muttered, "I don't know." That answer nearly pushed me over the edge. "You don't know?" Jess, you've been sneaking around behind my back for God knows how long. And you don't even know how long it's been. She wrapped the towel tighter around herself, like she could somehow shield herself from what was happening. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. It just happened. That line. It just happened. Like this was some accident. Like she'd tripped and fallen into 3 different affairs. My mind was reeling, trying to process the fact that my wife had been with not 1, but 3 men from my own base. Men I saw every day. Men I trusted. I felt like I'd been made a fool, like I was the punchline to some twisted joke that everyone else was in on. Was it all of them? I asked, barely able to look at her. Mike, Mitchell, even Thompson? She hesitated, then nodded, her eyes filling with tears. It was different with each of them. It wasn't serious. She sounded pathetic, like she was scrambling to find words that wouldn't make things worse. They were just distractions. I was lonely, you were gone all the time, and they were there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was justifying it, trying to explain away the fact that she'd betrayed me with men from my own unit, like it was somehow my fault for not being around enough. I felt the anger rising up in me again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to understand the extent of it, even if every word was like twisting the knife deeper. So, all this time I was busting my ass out there, worrying about you, thinking we were solid. You were what? Sleeping with them? Spending my deployments with my own friends behind my back. She nodded again, biting her lip, eyes fixed on the floor. It wasn't always like that, she said softly. At first, it was just talking. I felt lonely, and they were there to listen. I let out a bitter laugh. Listening? Is that what you call it? I held up her phone again, with the messages from Mike still glaring on the screen. Because from what I'm reading, there was a whole lot more than listening going on. She winced, and the tears finally spilled over. But instead of feeling any sympathy, I felt nothing. Just numbness. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. Hurt me? I repeated, my voice low. You didn't think this would hurt me? Sleeping with men I work with, lying to my face, making me feel like I was losing my mind for even suspecting something was off. She finally looked up at me, her face red and streaked with tears. I was lost, okay? I didn't know how to handle it, how to handle us. You were always gone, and I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. Her words felt hollow. She was trying to justify the unjustifiable, looking for a way to make herself the victim, to make it seem like her choices were somehow a reaction to my failures. But I wasn't buying it. Not anymore. So, what now? I asked, my voice harsh. You think I'm just going to forget this? You think we're going to go back to playing house, pretending none of this happened? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I still love you. I still want to be with you. The irony of those words hit me hard. Love. She claimed to love me, yet she'd broken every vow, every promise we'd made to each other. If this was her idea of love, then I didn't want any part of it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay composed. Jess, I said slowly, you didn't just betray me. You betrayed us. You betrayed everything we built, everything I thought we were. And you did it with people I have to see every day. Do you have any idea what that feels like? She just stood there, crying silently, unable to answer. I'm done, I said finally, the words heavy but certain. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend this marriage means anything after what you've done. She collapsed onto the bed, sobbing, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I felt hollow, like all the love and trust I'd once had for her had been drained out, leaving nothing but a shell. I walked out of the room, needing to put some distance between us, needing to breathe without her presence suffocating me. I didn't know what my next step was, but I knew one thing. This marriage was over. Leaving the room that night felt like stepping into a different life. A life I hadn't chosen, but one that had been thrust on me, ready or not. I grabbed my keys and walked out the front door without looking back. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't sit across from her and pretend there was anything left to talk about. I ended up driving around for hours, replaying everything in my mind. All the little errands, the late-night texts, the girls' nights that never quite added up. The way Jess had always been so involved with my life on base, always friendly with the guys. All those red flags I'd ignored, every gut feeling I'd brushed aside. It was like watching my life unravel in reverse, each moment revealing itself as a lie. Eventually, I pulled into a parking lot and just sat there, staring at nothing. The reality of it all was sinking in, the permanence of it. I knew that this wasn't something we could come back from. The trust was gone. And without trust, there was no marriage. It was over, and I had to accept that. I thought about calling Adam, but it was late, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to talk to anyone. But then my phone buzzed. It was Jess. She'd sent a text, a long one, and I knew from the preview that it was some kind of apology. But I couldn't bring myself to read it. Not yet. I turned off my phone, leaning back in my seat and closing my eyes, trying to shut out the weight pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I went back to the house, still unsure of what I'd do or say. Jess was waiting in the kitchen, her eyes red and swollen, clearly not having slept much. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and hope, like she thought maybe there was still a chance to fix this, to make it all go away. But I was done. I think we need to talk about what comes next, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. She nodded, looking down at her hands. I don't want a divorce, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve another chance, but can we try counseling? I'll do anything. I'll cut off contact with all of them. I held up a hand, stopping her. Jess, this isn't something you can just fix with counseling. This isn't one mistake or a single lapse in judgment. You betrayed me repeatedly, over years, with people I have to see and work with every day. You didn't just destroy our marriage. You destroyed my trust in you, and honestly in myself. How am I supposed to believe anything you say after this? Her face crumpled, and she started crying again, but I felt nothing, just an emptiness. Maybe it was shock, or maybe I was just numb from all of it. But her tears didn't stir anything in me. I'd spent years caring about her, worrying about her, giving her everything I could, and this was what I got in return. I'm going to file for divorce, I said quietly. I'll stay somewhere else for now. I don't think it's healthy for either of us to keep living under the same roof. She shook her head, reaching out for me. Please don't do this. I know I hurt you, but can't we at least try to work through it? I love you, I do. I know I made mistakes, but I want to fix this. I pulled away, her hand dropping to her side. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. Not with him, not with anyone. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a commitment, and you broke that commitment over and over again. The words hung heavy in the air, and I could see the realization finally sinking in. She'd lost me. There was no going back from this. I packed a bag and left the house that day, finding a place to stay temporarily. The guys on base quickly picked up on the fact that something was wrong, and I could feel the stares, the awkward tension whenever I walked by. Adam, true to his word, stayed by my side, supporting me without prying. He offered me a place to crash, but I needed space, needed time to process everything. Eventually, the rumors spread. You know how it is? Military bases are like small towns. Word gets around fast, and it didn't take long before people started piecing together what had happened. I could feel the pity in their eyes, the uncomfortable glances, and I hated it. I hated that I'd become the guy everyone whispered about, the one whose wife had cheated on him with his own friends and superiors. Over the next few weeks, I kept my head down and did my best to ignore the gossip. But it wasn't easy. Every time I walked into the mess hall or passed someone in the halls, I wondered if they knew, if they'd been part of it somehow, if they'd looked at Jess the same way Mike or Mitchell had. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very place I'd given so much of my life to had turned into a constant reminder of her betrayal. The divorce process started, and Jess kept trying to reach out, kept asking if there was any chance to make things right. She sent me long emails, texted me apologies, even showed up outside Adam's place once, begging to talk. But I couldn't do it. There was nothing left to say. In the end, the hardest part wasn't even letting go of her. It was letting go of the life I thought we'd have, the future I'd built up in my mind. I'd wanted to believe we'd make it, that we'd be one of the few couples who could survive the strain of military life. But that dream was dead, and I had to accept that. Walking away was brutal, but staying would have been worse. The months after I left Jess felt like moving through fog. Heavy, dense, and endless. I went through the motions, threw myself into my work, did whatever I could to keep myself from thinking about her. I couldn't even go home after work. It was like the silence in any empty room reminded me of everything I'd lost. Eventually, I took Adam up on his offer to crash at his place, figuring I'd at least have a distraction. But even then, the reality of what had happened kept creeping in. I'd replay the last few years over and over, searching for signs I'd missed, questioning every memory. I'd lie awake at night, wondering if I could have done something differently, if there'd been a moment I could have stopped it. But I knew, deep down, that this wasn't something I could have prevented. This wasn't a problem we could have talked through or a rough patch we could have worked past. Jess had made her choices that destroyed everything we'd built. The hardest part was facing the people on base. The pity was the worst of it. Even though no one said anything outright, I could feel the looks, the nods, the half-smiles. It was as if they all knew, as if everyone was trying to figure out how to look me in the eye after what Jess had done. Some of them probably did know, either from seeing things firsthand or from the gossip mill. A few of the guys who'd made those friendly jokes about Jess before suddenly stopped talking to me. Whether it was guilt, awkwardness, or something else, I couldn't be sure, and honestly, I didn't care. I wasn't about to waste my time figuring out who knew what or who might have looked the other way. The whole thing had made me reevaluate who I could trust, and that list had gotten a lot shorter. One day, I ran into Captain Mitchell in the hallway. It was the first time we'd crossed paths since everything came out. He looked at me, and for a second I thought he might actually say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse. But he just gave me this stiff nod and kept walking, his face a mix of guilt and discomfort. I wanted to confront him, to tell him exactly what I thought of him, but what would it have changed? He'd already shown me who he was. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much he'd hurt me. As for Mike and Thompson, they'd both transferred to different units not long after the whole thing blew up. I don't know if it was by choice or if someone higher up decided to get them out of my sight, but I was glad they were gone. Seeing them around every day would have been unbearable. Through it all, Adam was my anchor. He never pushed, never pried, just kept me grounded with the occasional beer and stupid jokes when I needed a distraction. He reminded me that there were still good people out there, people who had my back, even when it felt like the whole world had turned against me. Eventually, I started piecing my life back together. I moved out of Adam's place, got my own apartment on the other side of town. It was a fresh start, a place without memories of Jess lingering in every corner. I went through the divorce proceedings, which were surprisingly smooth. Jess didn't contest anything, didn't fight for the house or try to drag things out. Maybe she knew she didn't have the right, or maybe she just wanted it to be over too. The divorce papers came through a few months later. Seeing that final stamp of approval, knowing it was official, it was a strange feeling. There was relief, definitely, but also a sense of finality that stung. It was like saying goodbye to a part of myself, a part that had genuinely believed in forever. That part of me was gone now, buried in the wreckage of a marriage that had turned out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors. One night, Adam and I were out at a bar, just the two of us, trying to unwind after a long week. We sat in our usual spot, drinking in comfortable silence, when he looked over at me and said, "You know, man, you're going to be all right. This doesn't have to define you." I looked at him surprised. I hadn't said anything about Jess or the divorce in weeks, but somehow he knew. "I don't know if I even know who I am without it," I said, half joking but mostly serious. "You're still you," he replied. "Better off even. This stuff hurts like hell, yeah, but you're tougher than it. You'll come out of this stronger." I didn't fully believe him at the time, but his words stuck with me. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding, not just my life, but myself. I took up hobbies I neglected, spent more time with people I cared about, and slowly I started to feel like myself again. The betrayal still lingered, and I knew it would for a long time, but it didn't control me anymore. One day, I got a text from Jess. It was short, just a few lines, saying she hoped I was doing well and that she was truly sorry for everything. I stared at the message for a while, feeling nothing. No anger, no pain, just a strange sense of closure. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. By the time a year had passed, I'd finally started to feel free. Free from the memories, from the resentment, from the weight of what Jess had done. It didn't define me anymore. I was moving forward, one step at a time, learning to trust again, both others and myself. It was a long road, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I was on solid ground. And that was enough. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.